welcome. Although I think some of you have been here all morning, so it's great to meet you, and thanks for having me. Welcome also to anybody who's joining us online or watching this back. My name's Sholeh Johnston. You can call me Sho, because that's probably much easier for an afternoon together. We'll start off in a minute by just doing some introductions, because I'd love to get to know you all a bit more and to understand a bit more about what you'd like to get out of this. And I'll just briefly introduce myself as well. But overall, it really feels like this image kind of, for me, encapsulates what we're all here to do and the moment that we're living in. We're kind of in this amazing transitional time where our job through the interdependence movement, through any other initiatives and projects you might be involved in, is to kind of bridge the gap between a dysfunctional industrialized world to a kind of life-giving, reciprocal and regenerative society. So, and our theme really this afternoon in service of that is community engagement and collaboration. So as I understand it, you've spent this morning talking about the interdependence project and what it takes to kind of really start up initiatives and run campaigns. And hopefully this will be very complementary to that, and it will dive a bit deeper into what really good community engagement looks like, what some of the challenges and benefits of collaboration are, and what we need to think about, not only when we're kind of setting up interventions, activism, and kind of short-term interventions, but how we really sustain projects and campaigns over time to really bring about transformative change. So I'll just kick off with a bit of who I am and what makes it okay for me to sit here and engage with you all. So my background is predominantly in the arts and culture. For the last 8 years, I've been involved with organisations and projects that have looked at how we build intercultural dialogue, how we overcome different divisions in society, and most predominantly, how we address the climate crisis through creativity and through tapping into our kind of cultural capacity and resources. And a lot of that work has been with an organisation called Julie's Bicycle, who are really fantastic. If you are in the cultural sector, I really encourage you to look them up. And that work has very much been about how we bring about tangible transition to sustainable ways of working, empowering our cultural centres, how we use materials differently. And it's also been about leadership development and how we kind of awaken the creative capacity in each one of us to be part of movements of change. I'm also a writer and a coach, and I kind of dabble in lots of different things, and hopefully some of that knowledge will be useful to you today. So it will be great to go round and for me just to know who you are and then what's brought you here and what do you want to get out of this afternoon? Where do you want to be at the end of it, so I can also check what I've prepared against your expectations and what you really want to get out of it. So maybe if we start at this end and work our way around.
I'm Simon. Why am I here? Just to learn more generally about climate crisis. And I don't really have any expectations. I'm open.
Great, thank you.
Hello, my name is Igor. I'm here because also I'm interested in learning more about the climate crisis, but also to learn what is the best way to engage about the issue, and so I hope to come away with some knowledge about that.
Great, thank you, Igor.
Hi, I'm Sam, and I'm here because I want to learn more. And I think I'm particularly interested in how you activate that creative kind of energy that, like you said, I think is there in everyone. And I think sometimes we think it's not. So I'm just keen to learn more about that and hopefully come away with some ideas of how other people can think about that.
Lovely, thank you.
I'm James, and I'm here because last year I did a period of travelling, and there was a lot I didn't like seeing that was happening, and I've decided I want to get more involved in how we can make better changes, and so I'm on this programme to learn and find out what I can do to help.
Fantastic, thank you.
I am Adrian, and I am here to learn, and I am looking for a job presently. So it's very useful for me, this training, and it was part of my education. So I think it's a perfect opportunity for me, this one.
Great. Thank you, Adriana.
I'm Bianca. I'm here because I really like the project that the interdependence agency created, and so I wanted to join the community and contribute in making it possible. And I would really like to learn about useful tips of community engagement and how to get people on board, because I find this to be the hardest thing, especially when you believe in something other people don't really see to like get them on board.
Thank you, Bianca.
I'm Donna, and I'm a socially engaged artist. In the last few years, I've become preoccupied about climate chaos in particular, and the effects it has on artists and the responsibility we have as artists. And I'm currently working on a community-based project in Tottenham Hale with a designer, so it sort of involves natural building and growing the microgreens and working with communities. So I just thought today, I saw this morning, so I just thought, actually this is perfect, because it's the sort of engagement that we really need, and just to sort of meet each other and find out new ways. And
Great. Thank you, Dana.
And I'm Julian. I'm helping evolve lots of the helping organise lots of the independent stuff. And I guess I'm really interested in how something that genuinely inspires people, like the arts and culture, and music and creative pursuits, generally how that can be co-opted by a movement that really needs some inspiration in it. It needs something that inspires people to do stuff. I think, we had a workshop the other day that was looking at this from the point of view of Extinction Rebellion, and how they've involved art in how that's become a core part of their message and their methodology. I think it's a really underdeveloped and fascinating area of campaigns and making change.
Great, thank you. So hopefully we'll be able to touch on all of those expectations this afternoon. What I won't be doing is kind of deep diving into the kind of intricacies of the climate crisis, its causes, its key issues and messages. So I apologize for that, but we are going to dive deep into, once we kind of grapple with that knowledge, how we can kind of work with communities. So, bit of an overview for the next couple of hours. We're going to start with what are the barriers to engagement, because I think that's probably, we often jump to engagement and some kind of very deeply felt desire to campaign, to deliver messages, to try and bring people on board from our perspective. So we're just going to take a step back though and think about, okay, what is it that prevents people from engaging? Why are still the majority of our fellow citizens finding it difficult to connect with this? Then we'll look at some good engagement, kind of principles and practices. And as part of that, we'll also dive into, okay, what does it mean to think like an artist? How are artists taking on this idea of community engagement, and what can we, whether we are artists or not, learn from their approaches? Then we'll look a bit at effective collaboration and leading change. What are the different approaches we can take to then delivering messages to particular audiences, to leading projects which require people to kind of be active in them, and to build movements. So let's see how we go. Here we go. We haven't got much time, so let's dive in. Is there anything else that you think should be on there that's missing? Are there any burning questions? Great. Well, please treat this as very open. You can stick your hand up or shout or ask a question at any point. And there will be moments where we are active together and not just me speaking at you. If you're watching this back or you are at home now, we'll make sure that there are things for you to think about. And in the meantime, just to say, I think it's really good that you also reflect on why you've come to this webinar and what you really want to come away from this with as a journaling exercise, to really just start to get clear on your purpose and what some of your dark points are that you want enlightenment on. So, in pairs, I'd just like you to take some time, a couple of minutes each. I'll do a bit of timekeeping. And look at this question of engagement from both perspectives. When have you personally felt really deeply engaged in something? When was that moment? And what was it that made you feel so involved? Yeah? And then from the other perspective, when have you felt really least engaged with something? That you felt, probably this is good, but I'm not feeling it. This feels difficult, even though maybe it's something I care about. Yeah? So get into your pairs. I'll give you a kind of 2.5 minutes when you should swap from when have you felt most engaged to not engaged. And then a 5-minute call to swap over in your pairs, okay? And again, if you're at home, if you're with someone, do this. If you're not, do some journaling around this, and we'll also share our perspectives. So, person next to you, do we have enough? 1, 2, 3, perfect. We're an even number of people. So, kick off with when have you felt most engaged?
Oh, I got some examples. I'll be quick. I recently started training MMA in the last few months. Really engaged in it. So made me feel so engaged. Benefits that you couldn't think come from being involved in something like that. Better routine, better diet, community around the gym, actually the influence of positive role model, guys that work hard, do well, push themselves, better themselves, martial arts. When have you felt least engaged with something?
Everyday skills.
So what makes you feel maybe difficult? It's kind of the stuff I always come up with. What's going on? Most engaged, but probably like where's the solid ground to work? Where's the space? No, I mean where's the bedrock perception?
Oh,
Do you know what I mean? Where's the bedrock from work from? Like, I'm not even sure what's going to happen. Do you know what I mean? Just like this like bad news. So I find that makes it difficult to engage with, just because I think my personality and the way my mind's made up is like I need clear facts, clear things, otherwise I find it difficult.
there's a bunch of things, right? One of them, the easiest thing for me to put it is like a very simple is more focused.
Okay, if you haven't started talking about what made you feel least engaged, do that.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So yeah, fossil fuels are bad. Okay, yeah, that's fair enough. Then I was just trying to read just now. Can you actually create power from renewable? So create community of local energy production. To create local energy off grid, just hold it within a certain area. I was looking it up. It was like sounds like
It's harder than people. Some countries have
Oh my god, I just couldn't be a part of it. I guess for me, it's like,
didn't work. It was maintained one.
Well, because they just did it like this. like from the States that do it. And I think Iceland, where I think it's low population, well, maybe you can do it more than
You've still got time. Yeah. If you're really struggling, just go deeper. And if you're really done, then you can swap.
yeah. Well, I think engagement is something that I do in a sense that if you're doing something you have nothing else to do, so you know,
Yeah.
automatically trying to make the most of it. So I think when there's especially team things about making engagement, you know, looking.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you want to if you haven't swapped yet, if you want to kind of come to the end of the thought you're having and then swap over. Have you already finished?
No, thinking of the
Okay, cool.
You're not interested makes
Something doesn't catch your attention. Something you don't care about.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's just that kind of. It's going to play a huge part. Trying to engage.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, yeah.
Or they say that's cool, but they're not actually doing something.
Yeah, they're like, well,
Yeah.
I mean, some people think like, well, I'm not a genius, I'm not an engineer.
So how can I solve it?
Yeah, I can't solve it. I need to. This is an engineering problem. It's a technical problem. It's pretty simple in a way. Like you need to, not. You need to change the means of production, like plastics and stuff like that. It is a technical engineering problem, and you need to find alternative sources of energy.
Are you done?
Yeah.
Great, you guys are really on it. Bonus question.
I'm not an engineer, I'm a warehouse or something.
Just go deeper. We've only got a minute left, so.
But what do you want me to actually do? And I've got to drive to work, I've got to, pay my mortgage.
Okay, take another 30 seconds
Maybe it's fair enough.
to wrap your ideas.
A lot more engineers, but we need to keep pushing like people that know more technical degrees and more technical kind of.
It's all about law. Sometimes it's all about typing laws of stuff.
Yes.
The main, so I think mobilizing it for that.
Okay, are most people
Well,
talked out?
I mean, everybody can. Like, do that. Make them protest.
Kind of feel that they could go on forever. Right, wrap up your thought, take a moment. Yeah? Okay, amazing. So let's do some mining. What came out for you? When have you felt most engaged, and what was it that kept you involved with something?
we said sports, both of us find sports really engaging.
And what is it about sports that draws you in?
The teamwork, maybe.
What kind of teamwork?
For example, in football, it's very structured. Everybody has to work together, but then people also know their roles.
I like the benefits like that you wouldn't think are associated with sports, like the health benefits, eating better. Maybe if you've got practice or training that day, your day will be more structured than it might usually have been. Those sorts of things, where it kind of gives you some rails to work on, and you're always working towards something. There's always a progression to getting better. That's quite good for the psyche, I think.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else?
I sort of felt that when you're doing something that you can take pride in, you enjoy, but when there's more involved in it, benefits other people as well, then you feel more engaged. I suppose it's more purpose to what you're doing.
Love that. Anything else? That was.
something that might seem bigger than just yourself when you're involved with that, then feel more engaged.
Lovely, thank you. Anybody else want to share?
I guess in our group, this sort of links to what you were saying. Julia was talking about being engaged when you see that other people benefit from your actions, and that it's not as empowering when you're just doing something for yourself, but when other people benefit, it's actually amazing and it makes you want to do more.
Lovely.
So that's what came back to what you were saying.
Anything from your group?
To me, it was just, I don't know, having a similar experience to this one. For example, during my master's, was in a small group of people, we were like 20 people from all over the world, and it was the first time I really felt like, being part of a movement of engaged people that wanted to bring a change, and then we started doing things together just because we were like-minded and all purpose-driven. Yeah, it's just, I think it depends also about the people you're with and who you start with.
Thank you. Brilliant.
Maybe one more thing that just in relation to arts and creativity as well, it made me think that because the feedback loop with something like art or music, or if you're creating something, is so immediate in relation to the society or the wider group. You can make something, draw something, make a piece of music, play an instrument, and the feedback response is so immediate to that if you present it to others that it stimulates you to possibly do more of it. And it's quite a nice analogy, I think, perhaps for community engagement, is when you're not too abstracted from the feedback process. It's not like you're putting stuff out into social media land or doing something academic that feels very detached from the ultimate reality. And you're not having to imagine the feedback loop, you're actually perceiving it in real time. That's much more inspiring than seeing that you've had a certain amount of views or 3 people have downloaded your academic paper.
So there's something there about kind of the
Immediacy.
Yeah, the immediacy and the kind of exchange of feeling and knowledge and
like thesis, antithesis, synthesis kind of thing. The old Socratic method never fails, right?
sometimes the old solutions are the best. Great.
Greeks are onto it.
Yeah. Great. And what about least? When have you really just not felt? When has it felt difficult to engage with something?
For me, it's really,
Yeah, go
really
ahead.
the opposite of what I just said. So, for example, sometimes it happens that I see a group of people organizing an event about a certain topic that I'm interested with, and then maybe I go and attend the event, and I see that this group of people is like a bit closed, and they're all already all know each other, and they're all like experts in their own thing, and they're not really like welcoming newcomers' opinions, and like they don't look like they're really open to fully accepting people, and so you feel like, okay, the topic is really interesting, but I don't feel like doing an extra effort to be accepted in this group, and so kind of
Thank you. Were you going to say something? No? Anybody else?
I'm just going to say that I actually find it quite difficult to engage with this climate problem. I find it really hard. One, I think, because I live in the UK, I live in a developed Western country, so I feel that no matter where you are on the social scale, you're in the 1%. I am the problem. I was born into it. My culture is the culture that destroys it. And then when I want to step out of it and be like, okay, I probably need to do something about this. Like, it's so confusing and it's really hard to find any, like I was talking about the bedrock conceptually of like what's real, because I know it isn't like this, and I need to do more research, but it feels a bit like bad stuff is like winter is coming. You know what I mean? It's not like it's not this bedrock that I can conceptually hold on to. So I just would put a disclaimer out there that I actually find it quite difficult to engage and not be cynical and not just make the problem so complex and hard that I can just kind of then go back into apathy and go, well, whatever, like, it's too difficult to.
It's like scale. Scale is quite intimidating.
Yeah.
If you feel like something has loads of moving parts, it's like a big wall of like impenetrable information. It's like impossible to even think about how do I digest this.
Yeah.
I think scale of stuff is very off-putting.
Yeah.
You have sort of manageable chunks.
Yeah, massively, yeah. So I just put that out there.
Thanks for being so honest, because it's so useful. And does anybody else resonate with what he said? Little jazz hands for anybody else on the spectrum. Yeah, I think you've really.
I have to work hard to come here, you know, be like, okay, no, I'm going to go because I have the feeling that I want to, but then it's just, yeah, it's like I have to work to do it. It is difficult.
Yeah.
To engage.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've surfaced something really critical to the conversation today. So thank you for being honest.
Yeah. I think it's important to. I don't think you're part of the problem. Personally, my view. I mean, of course, maybe technically, it depends on your definition of what is being part of the problem. But I think if you look at, and this, it's like too negative to look at like that. I think it's important to just to chill about this whole thing and just do what you can. So, if you have a target, you say like, you know, we need this new policy, so I'm gonna mobilize people. This is my goal. This is how I'm gonna do it. But I think when you start looking like at yourself as like part of the problem and stuff, then it becomes too. You know, you need to always stay like relaxed and not overthink it. I think it's
Wise.
I think it's always important not to overthink.
Wise advice. We're going to get onto that. Any more? I want to mine a bit more on the. Anything else to add? Maybe that's the way to put it on when it's tough to engage.
Maybe if anyone's done part-time or temp work before and they're doing something that they're not necessarily interested in, but they have to force themselves to be interested in it and to keep going at it and tell yourself that this is what you need to do when you know it's something you're not enjoying doing. That's hard to engage with, and it sort of takes it out of you a little bit, and then that's why people go home at the end of working days and they're quite tired and feel a bit down because they've been doing something that they would have otherwise not been doing unless they had to for work or employment.
Yeah, and what's really tiring about that?
Just to just keep convincing your own mind, and you're sort of fighting for yourself that this is what I need to be doing, and keep going at it.
So you're kind of fighting against yourself. Powerful. Lovely, thank you. Any other bits before we move on? Great. Well, I think we could probably end the workshop there. You guys have nailed it. But what we've got here is really the kind of, we'll share all of this afterwards if people online can see that. But just to recap then, not feeling like you belong to a group, not feeling like there is an open door, that there is acceptance there. It does take a huge effort to walk into something because we are kind of wired for belonging, and we're also wired for shame when we don't feel like we belong to something. So this is a seed to plant, openness versus cliques. Cliques happen really naturally because we do gravitate to like-minded people. And we do gravitate to people who share our worldview and who are like in also our expertise. So there's a really interesting kind of provocation there about kind of how we open ourselves to a kind of wider web of perspective, expertise, skills, and we'll definitely dive into that. The I am the problem, it's very real. You're right, in an ideal world, we'd all be like, set goals, go for it, we can do this. But I think it's good to just create a bit of space in this time together for the very real sense that I think a lot of people, not just us out there, are feeling, which is this is massive. Where is my place? and it's not always easy to figure out where to go. So that experience of fighting against self and the experience of coming up against something which has a lot of scale. But you've already also started coming up with a lot of the key principles and solutions. And ones I would pick out are really kind of connecting with a purpose that's bigger than self, and how to kind of create that opportunity for other people, for them to be able to reframe their own experience and apply the skills that they have to supporting their community, to creating an impact that's bigger than just them. Creating a shared vision, creating the opportunity for feedback. All of those things we'll come back to, and hopefully you'll see in some of the case studies that we'll share today. So moving on, I won't really dwell on this, but I find this quite a useful, similar to the picture I started with. This is an image called the 3 horizons, and it kind of describes the fact that it's, you guys can't really see that, can you? Can you see this here?
Is that share free?
Basically, it kind of describes the times we're in. Business as usual, which is the world as it is kind of crumbling. We all know that. We all feel it. And in its absence, there is this viable future that's emerging with projects like interdependence, with movements like XR, with all of the permaculture growing, renewable energy, you name it, projects happening. They're kind of hinting at the possible future. But the space in between that, where all of the creativity and innovation is happening, is this kind of messy soup where we don't necessarily have all of the answers. We need to do a lot of testing and developing and working together and exchanging knowledge. And it feels difficult because there is a sort of uncertainty to it. And I'm just showing this because it's good to just surface the fact that this is the kind of period that we're in. We've got one foot in the past and one foot in the future, and sometimes it can be difficult to hold the splits for longer than a few seconds. So just going back to the conversations we've just had then, when we're kind of looking to engage people to be with us in that messy space, there are all sorts of causes of resistance that come up. And they're not always the ones we assume. So often in the arts and culture, more generally, we have a conversation about why aren't people engaging with the arts? And most of the time, there is this assumption that they're from a different cultural background, they are from the working class, they don't have the income to engage. There's all sorts of different broad generalizations, but actually when it comes down to it, sometimes it's about a conflict of interest. People just aren't interested in the way that we're framing something. It doesn't feel relevant to them. Sometimes it's just about time. Parents are busy, working 2 jobs, taking their kids to school, trying to catch up on the latest TV program and have a social life. Sometimes it's about power, and this is a really big one with communities. Sometimes people feel disempowered by not feeling like they have the right expertise, or not feeling like they just generally have agency over anything other than their immediate lives. And sometimes it's a matter of trust. Are you trustworthy to people? Have you earned their trust? How do we build trust? What is most important to you in building trust with a person or something that you want to get involved in?
Vulnerability.
Say more?
I feel like when someone doesn't project too strong and unified an image, I'm more inclined to trust it, because I think we're all fragile and conflicted and pulled around in loads of different directions, and I prefer it when people are honest about that reality rather than project something that's like, I am a strong, I'm always this thing that I'm presenting to you now, because I know that's not the case for anyone. So a bit of vulnerability makes me feel like, okay, I can trust you, you're more comfortable with that reality that we both share.
Does that resonate with anyone? That, like, honesty?
Yeah, I was thinking like don't lie, and it's kind of the same thing, because you feel like if someone's too sure to this is the way it is, then you kind of feel like, well, you can't be 100% right, can you? You can't. You must be lying to me to some degree, or being disingenuous to some degree. Yeah. Although, good liars do that on purpose.
Yeah. Because there's some comfort in, people realise that there's some comfort in others being presented with surety, or being presented with like, this is how it is, you know. That's why we like authority figures, you know, we like being told what to do, we like trusting that the government knows, you know, what's
Strong
going on
and
as
stable.
well. Yeah, exactly. It's a kind of masochistic tendency that humans have to kind of put a silly amount of faith in people who say they know what's going on.
And I guess some of these things are also very much linked to unconscious bias. You know, like we walk into the room and we're very much conditioned by our, you know, our society, our cultural background, our economic factors, whatever, to think that we are more inclined to you rather than you. And that's genuinely unconscious bias. And I think when we actually start unpicking why we've made this just completely absurd decision in the first 3 seconds, then perhaps we can see that we can trust people. But I think we judge very quickly, we judge everything, we judge all the times, and obviously it's impossible not to judge, but I think we can be better at just letting it go and just being more permissive in that sense.
Yeah, permissive. That's a really interesting word. It reminds me of a study that, I know this feels like a bit of a tangent, but it will come back around. Airbnb did a study around trust when they were launching their service. And before they introduced the opportunity to tell your host a bit more about yourself and those kinds of, you know, personal details, what they found is that people gravitated much more towards people who looked like them, or who looked like or sounded like they lived in a kind of middle class area if you're a middle class person or whatever. But as soon as they introduced the function for you to be able to tell a bit more about yourself, people were more prepared to take a risk on someone who wasn't like them, because suddenly there was some space, more space to find common ground. Oh, like you live in a totally surprising neighborhood to me, you come from a different cultural background, but you also like baking bread. Me too. So there is something really interesting about that relationship between just enough vulnerability and honesty and permission to be yourself, and that being a kind of concoction for finding common ground. But there is something really interesting in what you're saying about the balance between that and being clear enough for something to feel viable. So that's really interesting. We'll definitely come back to that. And then there are others like fear, need, habits, which connect really interestingly. Sorry, I know some of these are kind of very detailed diagrams, but I wanted to share this because it's important to also connect with, both for ourselves and others, what the emotional experience of change is. When we're inviting people to come on a journey with us, we are asking them to change. And this piece of mapping is basically kind of, it's called the Kubler-Ross change curve. It's also called the 5 stages of grief. And it basically describes the sort of emotional journey that you go through. So often when we are encountered with a need to change, so like let's take the example we're here to talk about, climate change does demand a kind of radical reimagination of how we live. And most of us, as you were saying, in the 1%, we're pretty comfortable most of the time, relatively speaking, in the way that we live. So we go through this kind of process which ranges from shock to denial. And denial's really interesting because denial can look like all sorts of things. Denial looks like me being a climate activist and flying to my cousin's wedding in LA last year. There's a kind of interesting relationship there with like part of my work and passions that I'm denying when I make that decision. So denial's really an interesting and complex animal. Frustration, why do I have to change? Like, why should I have to disrupt my life? Why should I have to feel so much? To depression, because it can be very overwhelming. And this, by the way, holds for something as complex as climate change through to like picking a new toothbrush. I mean, it's very interesting how this kind of plays out. But if we can move through depression, and depression is interesting because it also includes the question of who am I? It is an identity crisis, and I think much of what we're dealing with in the climate world is an identity crisis of who are we in response to this issue? Who are we in response to this need for change? But if we can move through that, we move into experimentation. Okay, I'll try it. I'll try a bamboo toothbrush. I'll buy an electric car. I'll go to this transition town meeting down the road. I'll come to this workshop from seeing it online this morning. Into decision making. Okay, I tried that. It worked. I'm going to make that part of my life. Or in the workplace, we've tried recycling bins next to everyone's desks instead of the garbage can. It's working. We're going to roll it out. Into integration. That change becomes part of how we are. It's now part of the new normal. And there are different ways that we can kind of encourage progress at every stage of that emotional response to change. So in the shock and denial phase, creative alignment. How does this align with our skills, our capacities as individuals or groups, with our innate capacity to imagine and be creative? Frustration is about maximizing communication, both communicating to people and giving them the chance to talk and be heard. Sparking motivation when that kind of, identity crisis kicks in. Developing capability for the experimentation phase. So what do you need to help you experiment? Do you need resources? Do you need a bit of money? Do you need knowledge? How can we help facilitate this? And then decision is about sharing knowledge. What worked? How can we scale it up? What have we learnt so that we can iteratively improve this, that kind of feedback process? Does that feel clear? Does it feel like it resonates?
Yeah, very much.
Have you been through some of these stages, or are you in one now?
I feel like I'm going through all of them all the time.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a spiral. Yeah. Exactly. As our knowledge evolves, as we do try new things, change is a constant.
There are also the different ways of looking at the same thing. You can be depressed about something that is also quite exciting, or you can feel frustrated about something that is maybe the realization of a denial, or they're kind of interlinked as well.
Mm.
Depression can always become a catalyst, I guess,
Yeah,
in the same way.
I think it's
And
probably one of the best
can
ones.
anger, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm angry that this is happening, we have to do something about it, sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than, oh, well, it's kind of fun.
Yeah.
Because that doesn't really get us to do anything about it. Sort of like, oh, it's fine then.
Absolutely. And that's a really nice provocation. How can you kind of understand and also harness people's emotions at different, like if you encounter anger, it's really useful actually to think about this when you're working with communities. We were talking a bit about this before we came in. If you're faced with this kind of real energy, even if it feels negative, how can that be kind of facilitated, co-opted into action? Because anger can be an amazing fuel for action. I mean, look at the climate strikes. Look at XR. So just some recapping then. When we're overcoming resistance, and this is something that really came through in some of your contributions as well, being clear and transparent is really important. And something that I've found really important, and found a quote, which I couldn't find again, but the essence of it is the difference between uncertainty and unclarity. One of them we can control, and the other one we can't. We can't control uncertainty. It's a constant in our lives, especially in the times we live in. We're always living with a certain level of uncertainty. In science, there is the uncertainty principle. 5%, always 5% is reserved with scientific findings for the fact that they've come so far in a journey and there's still some uncertainties, which is one of the reasons why it's been very difficult for climate scientists to say, yes, we're 100% certain about X, Y, or Z, or the climate models we've put together. And the press have really used that against them. But unclarity is within our control. At every stage of a process of change, we can be clear, we can be honest, we can be a little bit vulnerable about what we're trying to achieve, what's working, what's not working, how we're going about it. And if you're not really clear about some of that stuff, it's quite hard for people to engage. Then it's worth thinking about, is the resistance active or passive? So active resistance it's verbal, it includes action, it's on the surface. You're engaging with it, usually it looks like a conflict, an argument, Passive resistance is people saying, yeah, that's really important, and then going back to doing exactly what they were doing before, and it's a little harder to overcome, but we will look at some of the stuff we can do for that, and one of the most important things for that is listening. I know this might feel slightly left field for a conversation about how we activate people, because it feels quite unexciting. But listening is probably one of the most important skills you can come away from this with, because it really is a place where we can really get curious, we can get considerate, and we can find courage, both in ourselves and in other people. So we're going to try some active listening. Has anybody seen the 5 levels of listening before? No? Okay, so most of the time when we talk to people, we're waiting for our turn to speak. Yeah? Julian will be saying something, he'll be like, oh yeah, isn't the weather nice today? And I'm like, do you know what? I had some peanuts earlier. Something completely I'm just waiting to be heard. And that's quite a frequent kind of conversation. A little bit further along the line, you're having a conversation and you're constantly looking for the Me Too opportunity. Bianca will be saying to me, I'm really passionate about climate change, and I'm really getting into soil and food, and I'll be like, yeah, me too, and then I'll start telling my story. And it's still kind of, I'm waiting for my turn to speak, but at least I'm saying something relevant to what she's offered to the conversation. Level 3, does anybody here love giving advice as much as I do? You can tell, right? I'm sat here, yeah? We love getting into conversations, especially when we've got knowledge to impart. This is the hardest one for me, especially as a coach. Do it like me. So Sam will be like, I'm starting up this movement. It's called interdependence. We're going to mobilize people across the country. And I'll be like, Sam, do you know what you need to do? You need to start running a series of workshops to get people together. And he'll be like, yes, I know. Sometimes it's useful. When people ask for advice, it can be useful. If people aren't asking for advice, how does it feel? How do you feel when someone's giving you unsolicited advice? Okay, beautifully put.
Just oppose it instantly.
Yeah.
Because it's unwelcome.
You're never going to take it either. It might be good advice, but you'll be like...
Yeah. Some guy knocks on your door, open the door. I've got this fantastic plan. What you need is to put a solar panel on your roof. It'll cost you this. Are you ready to go? Maybe. I mean, it's solar panels, but you know where I'm going. Next level is encouraging. Yeah? Igor's like, I've got this idea. I'm going to go out into the community. I really want to start a permaculture project. I'm going to do it like this. I'll be like, that sounds amazing. Tell me more. What's happening there when I ask a question like that? And we've created space. Rather than a kind of tennis match, suddenly Igor has space to kind of unpack that. That's a really powerful place to be in itself. Questions are like your most important ally when you're doing community work. It cultivates curiosity, and most people are never listened to, really, when we look at this. Most people are in a tennis match conversation most of the time. The 5th level is silence. It is actively listening with every part of yourself, with your ears, with your eyes, just looking at everyone's body language, with your body, what are you feeling? What's happening in this telling, in this listening experience? And this is where, I have to say, magic happens. And we're going to try it. So we're going to get into pairs, into different pairs this time. And This is a suggested question. If you want to talk about something else that is on your mind right now, feel free. But my invitation to you is we're going to kind of do what we did before. But when you're listening, what I'd like you to do, quite literally, is basically a little bit more active than Igor at this point, but is to really kind of just practice, right, in your chairs now. Just plant your feet on the ground. I promise we'll get to the art. Trust me. Plant your feet on the ground. Sit. Be active. Sit up in your seat. Relax into that. Just take a really big, deep breath. And breathe out. And just feel how that feels. Feel your feet on the ground. Get really grounded. Feel how the energy is moving through your body. Feel your eyes kind of come awake. It's the afternoon. I know you've had lunch. Your stomach is like drawing all of your energy to it. But stay with me. Just feel your ears come alive. And I'd like you to just kind of cultivate like a really warm sense in your torso. Just feel a lot of warmth gravitating there. And if you're sat next to the same person, very tentatively just get up, make eye contact with someone else, and move to them. When you're ready, go for it. You have a new pair, that's great. And so in your pairs, I am going to time and you'll hear a ding at the end. So the person who's going to listen first, you're going to ask, what change do you want to make in your community? And you're going to then reconnect with that state of listening. And you're just going to be there, fully present for this person. You can make eye contact, but try not to make sounds. Try not to don't feel like you have to show them that you're listening. Just be present for your pair. And the other person will start with the change I want to make is, and speak for 5 minutes. And if you fall into silence, that's okay. Just hold that space and see what happens. Trust me. Yes, so if you are watching, if you are in a group at home, try this with us. And if you're by yourself, again, take this time to journal. What is the change that you want to make in your community? And what are some of your reflections coming out of what we've discussed so far? And I really invite you, when you've finished the webinar, to find someone. It might be a family member, it might be a colleague, someone around you who's willing to try this with you. Great. Any questions? No? Okay. If you want to spread out a bit more in the room, if you want more privacy, if you want to come onto the stage, I'll piss off to the back. But let's go for it. 5 minutes each and see what happens.
All right, I'll speak first.
The good thing about this is that you don't know what the person listening on.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure exactly. I'll start. Exactly sure.
That's fine. I will.
I mean, I can't.
Don't know.
No, it's fine.
For each other, my friends, family, talking about
Okay. Well,
the community.
time probably doesn't have much to do with time, to be
University.
honest.
That's where I spend now most of the year. So
There's a lot of
I'm gonna go ahead and have 5 minutes. I'll speak about both. I think
young
in the community
and
university,
in my community.
it's already very important to engage one. So I
Stay
think that
close to me,
interest
like
is there,
on Sunday.
and I'm more focused on orienting that interest to
It's like, I don't know, it's like the idea that
non-judgmental emotions.
okay, so I'll give you
Because
the context notes. So you see my bag over there. I started training MMA, boxing, kickboxing, jiu-jitsu, wrestling,
On any side of any
and like
argument, people should,
I didn't realise
ask themselves and think objectively.
like
Um,
that they were
when
winning
the right
as
thing
well,
might
but back as hard as he could.
underlying
And then the trainer was like, hey, you come in.
and
And he thought instantly, I thought he was in trouble. Do you know what I mean? It's, oh, I'm going to get told off, been aggressive, you know, every time I'm aggressive I get told off, you know, I'm not allowed to be, you know. And the guy was like, Jack, bang, come on, bang, come on. And he was like, like, you know,
I think it's fine if people
I'm being rewarded
people are not
for
interested in
my aggression.
That's fine, as long as you,
And I read that and I was just like,
look at problems,
something went off in my brain and I was like,
objectively and overseeing
it's really difficult if, because there's a certain percentage of the population
can you make
that
sure
are
that,
just
it works
kind of aggressive males, like hyper competitive. You know, they're the people that get gold medals if they're in the right environment. They're the people that grow up to be like, you know, professional athletes and footballers. But if they grow up in the wrong environment, then that hyper aggression and that competitiveness can be like, you know, really bad. And especially if like it's constantly just like, don't be like that. It's like there's an element of themselves that they're just repressing. So in some way,
Keep going, mate. Minute and a half.
Community is to just, I don't know what it is.
Be in
It's like
silence
all those
and
things,
see if something else
the
comes.
violence, the shootings, the stabbings. You know, like I've seen a dead body. I didn't actually see the body, but you know, there was a fatal stabbing.
I guess already voting is
two right at the bottom of my road since I've lived there. And it's just like, if these guys could just go and like wrestle for like 2 hours, they'd be tired. They'd be like, I don't want to fight no one anymore. You know what I mean? Like, they boxed, they just did something. And then they would have a respect for it as well. Like, they would, like, if you're good at it, if you're good at fighting, and someone wants to fight you, you're like, well, because I'm going to fucking hurt you. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I just feel like it, and it's just that thing that the guy, when he thought he was going to get told off, because his whole life, and then he became this guy became a champion boxer. Do you know what I mean? Like, he just won a belt, and so it was like, all he'd ever known his whole life was being told off in your back for that competitive spirit, that I want to compete, I want to be aggressive. And then once he was, you know, told it was okay, that's fine, just smash back. You know, there's a sport where you can do it.
Okay.
Went on and, you know, bettered his
So
bettered his life.
finish the sentence that you're speaking now.
Something towards that change, trying to get the young guys that are so violent and don't have any.
And when you come to a kind of natural place to close your thought and swap over. So thank the person that's been listening to you and swap over. So take the time to thank the person who's been listening to you and swap over. I know it's tempting to get into a conversation. Yeah. Yeah. So give some space now to your partner and swap over. And don't forget to ask the question to start it off.
I guess part of that is making everybody feel that this matters more than all the other issues that I don't see. Whatever it is, these are all non-issues for us. So there's no comparison. None of these connected with the consequences there. I can very, very impactful. Certainly when I was at primary school, the stuck with me for years and years about consequences, and that's like how you can't just act without thinking about the impact of it. It's so simple, but we're so extrapolated from our impact, we're so extrapolated from our consequences. If there was ways to become aware, conscious, become engaged with our impact, I think it would require quite a big mental health crisis to overcome it, because I think it's denial that gets people through the fact that we're a parasitic species. You look at what we've done to the earth in like, what's it called, a time lapse. We look like a swarm of locusts taking over a planet. That's what we look like. We just destroy everything and build our shit and then destroy ourselves. It's like we look like a horrendous species, and we are a horrendous species. Not playing fair, not playing cooperatively. But we have this unique ability to be able to see that for what it is. But to be able to see it, we have to overcome the emotional difficulty of grasping something so dark and so scary and so anathema. We like to think of ourselves as godly creatures, like moral, God knows what, kindness and empathy and all these things, and actually like they're just pushed out the way by the systems that we built to sustain ourselves.
Okay, so close the thought that you're on and take a moment to thank your partner. And rejoin the circle when you're ready. Yeah, shall we rejoin? Great. Sam and Adriana, do you want to rejoin us? Okay. So, first of all, before any content, how was that experience for you of being listened to and listening?
It was good. I feel like sometimes, though you realize that when you talk to someone, it's good to have like at least a yes or like to see that the person is actually following you or kind of agrees with what you're saying. But it was good.
And what was the feeling behind that kind of need for some kind of...
Maybe I was not saying something so right or so interesting because like just looking at me and not saying anything. I don't know if I was actually saying something that could be of interest to him or that maybe he was thinking, oh, she's so stupid, what the hell she's saying? So naive.
Did anybody else feel that kind of like, am I on the right track, bubbling up?
We couldn't help but every now and then do a usual sort of like nod or just to show that you're listening. Couldn't help it sometimes.
Yeah.
But it was good because when you're just listening, you definitely take more in. Because when you have a conversation, you're saying and you're thinking about what you're going to say next. When you have a usual conversation, you probably do neglect some of what they say because your mind's thinking about what you're going to say. So just listening, knowing that you can't say anything else, you're taking more in. You're supposed to remember more from the conversation than who's actually communicating back.
Nice. Did anybody else feel that they're suddenly being able to perceive more or hear more?
As a speaker or as a listener?
Both. Or anything else that came up for people?
I feel a bit like some of the rapport is lost. some rapport training once,
Mm.
and one of the easiest ways to build rapport with someone, obviously there's like the cheap tricks of like mimicking body language and all that sort of stuff, but then finding that common ground, like you talked about, the just like me, like what was it, level 3,
Mm-hmm.
where you pick on something and then you go, oh yeah, I do know what you're saying because I had this experience, and that is actually in the rapport training, like the deepest level of rapport. When you get to that point and you can start finding common ground, that's when you find that people sort of in their own bubble, where they get that. I find that if I was just doing that like fully active listening, I feel like I can't get that level of rapport where you're going to end up in that little bubble where like the world doesn't exist and stuff. So I just felt like there was a little bit, but maybe that's just because of my experience and the way that I generally conduct myself, and it felt so alien. It might be because of that.
But I think you've hit on a really useful thing, which is, you know, when is this kind of listening really important? And when can you kind of take that depth of listening into different ways of interacting with people? When is it appropriate, absolutely, to kind of build a shared sense of energy and rapport? And so I think you're absolutely right. There is some of this which is situational, which is, you know, in different contexts, it's important to take on different ways of relating. But this was just to give you a sense of what it feels like to really listen and be listened to. But thank you for that. It's an important insight.
I actually think this is a really good exercise for the speaker as well. For example, in my case, sometimes when I don't know, it's my turn to speak, I feel like, oh, maybe I don't have so much to say, you know, like I feel short of arguments. I don't know, just maybe I'm a bit insecure, but then when you have 5 minutes, you know, you have to speak and you start talking, and then suddenly your head is traveling, and like you just have so many things to say, and it's good for people that maybe are a bit insecure and so, like they want to participate but they don't feel like they can, and then if you kind of have to do it for 5 minutes, you find out that you actually have a lot of things in your head that you want to.
I felt like if you'd have had 5 more minutes again, like you were ramping up, you know, like you were kind of like getting more and more comfortable, and then like I could sort of see the cogs whirring in your brain, and you were sort of figuring things out.
Like light bulbs coming on.
Yeah, like it was good for you. I think I felt like it was good for you to do that, like, and that you were sort of figuring out your own thoughts and like actually learning things about yourself through doing it. That's what I noticed.
Thank you for sharing
You
that.
were very interesting as well. I was engaged. I enjoyed what you said.
That's lovely. And because Dan, also, you mentioned permissiveness earlier. I think that was one of the words that came up. And I think you've hit on a great insight, which is that we have different personalities in any group. Some people are super comfortable in, this is my opinion, this is what I think. And some people aren't. Some people are either introverted, or it's harder to express themselves in language, or whatever. And this can be in that situation, talking about situational, it can be a really nice way to just give them the space to do. So some people think out loud. I think, I come across ideas as I'm speaking. Some people figure stuff out and out it comes. And particularly for those kinds of people who think while they speak, this can be a really generative way of brainstorming, of discovering insight and knowledge. When we're in a community, people have all kinds of knowledge and expertise, which might not feel relevant to them to climate change. A grandma might know how to make entirely seasonal food from stuff that she's grown in her garden, but might not connect that at all with something that you're interested in engaging her with. But sometimes that giving the space for someone to kind of find that connection themselves with a good question can be powerful. Any other insights? I know that you had a few periods of silence. How was it sitting in those awkward periods of silence, if anybody had that experience?
It felt kind of a bit a lot of it felt analogous to performance. I'm reminded of the distinction between practicing music by myself and playing music on stage, and how when you're on stage and performing, you feel you've got one ear that's listening to what you're doing, like in an immediate response, but then another ear is almost projecting yourself onto the audience and listening on their behalf, because you're trying to mould what you're doing to fit the situation, or try to give some kind of performative impression that evokes a certain response in an audience, which isn't just about you. And I feel like when you're confronted with a non-responding conversation partner, it's a bit like that, because you're not working. You're nodding at me now when I'm saying things, and that's reassuring me that I'm not speaking absolute bullshit. I mean, I know that I am, but when you don't have that, which is similar to playing music, you don't have that reassurance all the time unless people are jumping up and down and like loving it, which most of the time they're not. You have to kind of create a sort of imaginary third person that views yourself from afar, and it felt like I had that kind of same scrutinous character just off stage right, which puts more emphasis on the silences. It definitely does that. And you're like, I've had that like playing gigs and stuff, and I'm like, I'm not playing, there's no music. Oh, that's interesting. And becoming conscious of that and thinking, it's probably a bit awkward for people now. I should probably play something again. It just felt analogous to that. I thought I'd
Kind
say
of
that.
interesting how afraid we are of silence, isn't it? Just need to fill it. Oh crap, nothing's happening. It's the make stuff happen impulse sometimes. Did anybody feel like something different, which was, there's silence, and then something unexpected or something more is coming up that I didn't think was there? Or I thought I was done, but I kept going.
Well, I mean, when you make someone think that at some point something's going to come up, obviously, no? As in, like, you said 5 minutes, we speak for 2 minutes, and we have 3 minutes left. Chances are something's going to come up in those next 3 minutes. I mean, if we did an hour, more stuff would come out.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for partaking in that experiment. And as we were saying, it's not that this is exactly the way you need to do it every time. So when you sit down with a community member, right, we've got 5 minutes, off you go. Let's see how it goes. It's just about kind of like knowing how it feels, to listen and be listened to.
Actually,
yeah.
I had someone say to me once that if you count to 3 when someone stops talking, then you can talk. Don't just wait until they have a pause in their thought and jump in. Wait, 1, 2, and then they'll start again, because then they'll get that thing that comes up sometimes. So maybe that's useful, like a halfway between.
I love that. Thank you. You can adapt this in different ways. Absolutely. Create your own tricks for.
Yeah, I forgot about that, but it does.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's good.
Really useful. Let's try, has anybody seen the systems iceberg before? So I know it looks a bit complicated, but basically when we're looking to kind of change surface level events, like people using single-use plastic or keeping their lights on all the time, or holding a completely dysfunctional parliamentary session, we call that a presenting event. And in systems change, which is just a school of thought and practice which looks at how we deal with complex problems, there is this kind of model of the iceberg that's used, because we see only 10% of an iceberg. Most of its body is underwater. And it's used as a metaphor for talking about how the sort of presenting events that we encounter are 10% of what's really going on. That's what we see that's visible. And there's a whole iceberg underneath them which makes those events keep happening. right? And there's 3 levels under the water, which I'll just talk through really briefly. One is patterns of behavior. So someone uses a plastic bottle once is a presenting event. Someone who buys a plastic bottle every day is a pattern of behavior. So sometimes just noticing patterns can be really useful for deciding, okay, what's a complex problem here? If someone's consistently buying plastic bottles, despite lots of alternatives being available, that's a pattern of behavior. Then there are the underlying systems which enable that pattern. So plastic bottles keep getting manufactured. That's a system that enables a pattern of behavior. And then one level under that is the mental model, basically the beliefs, the values, the behaviors that we all hold, the identity stuff, which means that that structure and that pattern and that event keep happening. So it's just easier for me to buy a plastic bottle than to wash and take my bottle. This is a really crass example, but for me to do that. And I have values around not wasting my time, believing my time's precious, believing there are better things for me to focus on in terms of environmentalism, like taking the train or being vegan, than worrying about single-use plastic. There might be all sorts of ideas that I have that I may not even be conscious of. It might even be that in my culture, people have been using the same things for years and years and years, and it just seemed really backwards. And I want to go with the convenience of a 21st century lifestyle, which is buy plastic. I'm really not speaking from a personal place here. But
You're recorded, huh?
yeah, now it's on tape. Damn it. Exactly. No, it's good. Let it all hang out. So I know that it might seem a bit overly complex, but the point here is that when we're engaging people and we're asking them to kind of come on a journey with us, what we are really encountering at some level is their sense of identity, their values, and their belief systems, which might hold them in a particular way of being, and might be encouraging them to support dysfunctional systems. And unless we speak to that level of consciousness, it's very difficult to kind of move beyond it. And we can also look at these 4 levels of different levels of kind of redesigning solutions. Yes?
What's this model called?
It's called the systems iceberg. And there's a worksheet that I can also, I'll share a bunch of resources with you all and for those who are online afterwards. But this also tells us, at what level, what kind of change we can expect. So if we just look at surface level events, we're just reacting all the time. We're just immediately reacting to what's going on. And that's where a lot of activism happens, and that's okay. We call those holding actions. We don't want to use plastic, so let's just stock shops with reusable bottles. Let's shame people for not recycling, that kind of reaction. Pick up litter. Then with the next level, when we perceive patterns, we can start to anticipate behavior. Okay, people keep doing this, so we can anticipate it will keep happening, and maybe we can think about a more interesting solution to that. When we look at systems, we can redesign things. We can say, okay, there's a system here. People keep manufacturing bottles, or people aren't recycling enough. Can we create a new solution which will incentivize recycling, at least, so that we start creating a circular waste economy? But when we speak to people's mental models and values, there lies transformation. There lies the ability to kind of move someone from a way of thinking that is inherently creating the problem or being the problem to a new way of thinking. And there's a charity called Common Cause who've done some really interesting mapping about values and how they correspond to different personality types, basically. So we've got some people who are predominantly driven by tradition. They are often devout religiously or devout to a particular ideology. They're quite moderate in their political beliefs. They have a real respect for tradition. They could be quite humble, and they could be quite detached because their belief system might tell them that, this is all a transient reality. and it will pass. Does that remind you of anyone? It's where some kind of conservative, like people sit on the spectrum. No judgments, but that's often some of the things that drive them. And on the other side, we've got hedonism. People who want to enjoy life, they want to be self-indulgent, they love pleasure. This is the kind of side of us that most often comes out at music festivals, perhaps, or nights out. And it might be that people sit across many different parts of this spectrum. But understanding what people's values are, what matters to them, not in terms of a specific issue, but in terms of their everyday lives, can help create ways into engaging with them, which is aligned with what they're looking for. So why festivals are a really interesting place for engaging people between the ages of 16 and 32 with environmentalism or any political issue. It's where you have all of those stalls, often at some kind of strategically placed part of the festival. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt that, just because it triggered a thought. Hedonism is such a good way in for people to see that actually climate change can be fun, because often activists just look like they're downers, they're depressed, they're constantly preaching. That's the general opinion on activists. And it's just so important to show people that we're having a great time doing this. We are doing it out of pleasure, not
Absolutely.
Not just out of necessity.
I don't think that the general view of activists is that they're downers and depressors. I think the actual view might be that they're too hedonistic. They just sit around smoking weed and doing nothing, and like they love taking drugs. Like, I think that's actually a pretty common view. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like your conservative guy will
US,
sit there and say, crusties or whatever, just living it up.
It's that activist stuff.
Please do.
That's not how I think.
No,
Yeah.
true. But I think
Thank
it's
you.
perception. I'm not talking about reality. I'm just talking about perception. I
It's
think.
just there are loads of types of people, for example, So if you say, you would probably general opinion of vegans is not that they're doing nothing. Is that they're actively convincing you to become a vegan, right? And that is perceived to be annoying. For example, that's sort of the example that I mean. I completely take your point, and I think that's the other side of the spectrum as well, that people are considered to be just lazy and just kind of, not doing much, and that's sort of their lifestyle. But yeah.
And this conversation is like the perfect example of how, depending on where you sit on this spectrum, you perceive other people, or you perceive different kinds of invitation to act, or different kinds of projects. As you were saying, our traditionalist over here will kind of look to the hedonistic end of the spectrum and be like, wasting their lives, drug culture, destroying tradition, I'm going to stay safe over here and kind of other them. So this is the kind of landscape that we're in. And this is just a breakdown of each of these different areas of, yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think that's why it's so important to have different people in the environmental movement. So you see this historically, that you need different types of people to achieve change. So the Vietnam War, for example, when it first started, it was just the usual anti-war activists, and so people perceived them to be hippies, as against any war, etc. But when it changed was when you had war veterans coming out against the war and saying that people are being killed needlessly, and at that point it became hard for the government to just brush them off as like, oh, they're just a bunch of hippies, because you had war veterans and trade unions coming out against the war. And so in the environmental movement, it's important to not, I think, conflate political views and just have people like Greens or something coming out, but you need members of parliament, you need workers, industry. I think that's just important to keep in mind.
Thank you so much for that. And it really hits on a kind of critical principle, I think. It hit on many things, but one thing to draw out of it is that the messenger matters. Sometimes you're not the best person to engage a particular group of people. And it's a really great principle to think about depending on what kinds of projects or campaigns or whatever it is that you get involved with from here, to think about who is it who's going to speak most to this person's worldview or convincingly on this issue. Absolutely. War veterans coming out against war, very difficult to argue with it. Yes, activists coming out to talk, be against war is normal. There's nothing outrageous about that. It's entirely what people expect. So, again, this is a resource that I'll share, and we could have a crack at it. How do people feel about doing something more hands-on before we go to the cultural case studies? Okay, no, don't worry. Entirely metaphorical. This is an empathy map. It's used actually a lot in design thinking. If anybody's familiar with that, it's just a way of designing solutions, products, whatever, that actually begins with building empathy. I think it's a really useful map for thinking about engaging particular groups of people. And what it does is it just invites you to immerse yourself in someone's worldview. Starting with who are we empathizing with? Like, who's this person we're trying to understand, or this group of people? It works very well if you pick an ambassador of a certain group who's kind of not a stereotype, but a kind of typical character. What do they need to do? What are we asking them to change? What needs to happen? What do they see? What do they say? What do they do in their everyday lives? What are they hearing a lot? What are the messages they're getting? Where are they getting their information from? And then what are their pains and gains? I'm just wondering about time and whether we can kind of take this and maybe come back to it and get a bit active with it after we've kind of looked at some of the case studies. But this is basically, I think, one of the most useful tools you can use when designing campaigns. Because if you can start from a place of empathy with somebody else's worldview, then you can really craft a message and craft an approach, creative or practical or whatever it looks like, that meets them where they are. One of the challenges, particularly with climate change, is that people are in different places with their engagement with it, with that relationship to the change curve, and their capacity to act and engage. So designing stuff like kind of engaging with people at this depth can really help kind of surface what those solutions are. We're about halfway through, so I think we should have a break. So let's take 10, 15 minutes, grab some coffee, and any kind of informal questions. If you're at home, and you don't feel like a comfort break, yeah, go for it. Sketch out the empathy map and think about someone that you really want to engage, might be finding it difficult or might be projecting into the future, and have a crack. And we'll be back soon. So yeah, let's talk a bit about imagination and empowerment. Many of you will already be in this space. It sounds like we've got artists and music makers and probably many more things in the room. But I just wanted to share a few case studies of what we're talking about, because I think that's the best way to talk about this when we're speaking about arts and creativity and culture in this space. And I will begin by just sharing one more model that I think is really useful when we're thinking about taking action, to just open ourselves to, or create a language for kind of placing different kinds of responses, different kinds of engagement. And this is a model from Joanna Macy. Does anyone know Joanna Macy's work? Some yes, some no, that's cool. She's an activist, she's an ecologist, she's a Buddhist. She has been mobilizing people in the environmental movement for decades. I really invite you to take a look at her work. She has a book, she has a methodology called The Work That Reconnects. And her work is all about how we move from a place of disempowerment and heavy emotion around the climate crisis to a place of activation and feeling purposeful and able to respond, being response able. And she has a book called, she has many books, Active Hope, and I've forgotten it. Why have I forgotten it? I will think of it. A great work detailing exercises that you can go out and do with people, whether it's how we process grief, how we create space for voices that are typically not heard, so marginalized peoples, other species, land and wildlife and biodiversity. So I invite you to take a look at her work. She's got lots of resources on her website. And she's called something, she's described the times we're in as a transition from what we talked about at the beginning, an industrial growth society to a life-sustaining society. And she categorizes 3 different types of action in what she calls the great turning, this great turning from one way of living to another. And those 3 kinds of response are holding actions, which is this first one over here on the left. And that's where activism lives. And those are actions where you see something happening that needs to stop, so deforestation, and you get up and you stand in front of the diggers and you say, stop. This just needs to stop here. And we don't necessarily know what comes next, but we just need to stop this right here. So that's a holding action. Then we often move from that place into creating alternative structures, different systems, different ways of behaving, different options for people to be different, to be able to organize their lives and their decisions differently. And the combination of both those things also contributes to the third area, which is shifting consciousness and values. So that's what we were just talking about, remember, the different kinds of values and mindsets that produce the actions and the behaviors that might be problematic in the context of climate crisis or climate breakdown, climate catastrophe, all of those things which are really the same thing. So those shifts in mindset and belief systems, and those 3 all interconnect. They all contribute to the change, profound change in society and at the local level, what we've been talking about, community, and the culture of how we live and relate to each other. So I just want to share some projects. There's so many out there. There's so many I can name. I mean, probably Dana could speak to us for several hours in her own right about other projects. I'm sure many people in this room could. Welcome, Igor. Join us. So Tree Office was a project commissioned by Arts Admin in 2016. Arts Admin is an organisation based in near Whitechapel in Aldgate in London. And this was a great project. It basically wanted to explore the value of nature in a very tangible way. And so the artists constructed a tree office, an outdoor space that anybody could book to use. It was summertime, and that doesn't mean much in the UK, but nevertheless. And people could book that space, and the money that they paid for it went directly into the stewardship of that piece of land that the office was based on, and the shelter and the space that the tree was providing them as an office. So it was a way of just kind of getting people to connect with the idea that nature has intrinsic value, that we are exchanging with and drawing on and interacting with all the time, but through a mechanism that most people relate to, which is booking space or paying for services. It's a way of getting people to kind of conceptualize something more tangibly than is possible when we're talking very conceptually about the value of nature and how we need to kind of more tangibly value it in our everyday lives. Indeed. Another project, this is a stage designer called Tanya Beer, and she decided to embark on a PhD which was about how do we build a living stage? How do we not only lessen our impact on the environment, but create a net positive effect through the projects that we do? So not just carbon mitigation or reduction in emissions, but how do we create net positive benefit? And this really connects with some of the principles that you all came up with at the beginning, which was how do we create added value, that sense of benefits above and beyond, immediate carbon reduction or plastics reduction, which might be well-being, community, all of those things. And I think this really also starts to play into something that you also mentioned at that point, which was goals, rails, ways, structures in which people can kind of go on a journey to connect with making tangible things happen. I think that's really a principle for you to kind of sit with and embody. How do we create structures in which people can get creative and feel like they're moving forward with something? So what Tanya did was to say, okay, we want to ultimately build a performance area, but what we're going to start with is the practice of communally growing food. So she created these crates, wooden crates made of recycled materials, and spent 3 months initially in Melbourne, then in Cardiff and London, and she's now done it in places all over the world. Spending 3 months with the local community, planting together, learning about food together, and creating a community garden. When those boxes were full of edible grown produce, then with the community they created this performance space, so this stage area in an outdoor place, and they programmed professional artists, community theatre groups, choirs. They had cooking demonstrations. They just created a program of fun, creative activity. And when that program was over, the community were given a choice. You can either each take a box away to your home. And actually, I should say, while the performances were going on, people were encouraged to kind of go up and eat the stage, to kind of pick stuff and learn what's growing there and taste it tangibly, like connect with that sense. And then at the end, as I said, they could either take a box home or they could reconstruct the community garden that they'd built together and collectively manage it. And people in different locations have taken different choices. But I think it's a really nice way of saying, she was very preoccupied with the idea of how do we do theatre sustainably? How do we use better materials? How do we save energy? How do we continue our creative practice in a better way? And so I love this for its principle of net positivity, how you can create more benefit than negative environmental impact. And I love the project itself as well, with the idea that we can also create new spaces for communal experience and reconstruct a sense of community where often it's being broken down. Then there is, we want to initiate a change in people's relationship with energy, for example. So get people acquainted with renewable energy and scale up renewable energy solutions. So there is a power company called Firefly Solar Systems who developed a portable solar power unit. And they went straight to the festivals market and worked with festival promoters and producers to start powering festival stages and spaces, so also kind of working spaces or trading spaces with solar energy, but making it very visible. And they not only created a testing ground for their own technology, so how can we apply this for different uses, but they also created the opportunity for festival goers to engage with renewable energy and in a new environment. And what was great about this is using that kind of creating testing space of a festival, which is a great place where people are often suspending their everyday beliefs or disbeliefs, and are in a different kind of headspace anyway. But they also managed to prototype a really, really well put together product over a number of years, which they're now using in all kinds of different community situations. So they're now taking this product to off-grid villages in parts of Africa, for example, places that don't have grid energy, and they're fast-tracking a dirty grid system to give them solar energy off the cuff. So again, how can we use existing creative spaces as places of possibility to test out solutions that can then be scaled up in different ways, more sustainably in communities?
I think, is it the Small World stage? They do that.
Small World stage, yeah?
Yeah, they run it all off solar, I think.
Fantastic.
Right? Yeah, I played there loads of times. I mean, they get a bit of a bad rep for their power, but...
Yeah, the subs are often a bit farty.
Yeah, sometimes the lights
Quite enough
steer
power.
in and out. But if people want to learn more about how they do it, that's one people in the UK that do that.
Fantastic. And there's also a movement called Powerful Thinking, which is a network of festivals, small and large scale, and renewable power suppliers who specifically supply festivals and events, who are kind of working together. They have a Festivals 2025 strategy, and they're trying to kind of do a lot of the research and the work which will actually answer some of those tough questions, like how do you provide kind of consistent power, how do you create a really good experience for people, and leapfrog some of those challenges. So thanks for prompting that. Igor, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, my school built, they're building a new building and they made the whole roof to be solar panels.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a really good idea because the owner of the school before, he was like, he didn't believe in climate change and stuff like that. He was really against the environment, but then he retired, but his son was very environmental, and yeah, so he kind of changed a bit how the school works in a good way. In that
Fantastic.
Which school?
What's the name of it? It's called Rose.
Rose.
Yeah, but
Like the wine.
yeah, sweet, drinks,
Yeah.
but yeah, it was something very good. Actually, his dad did end up believing after he saw the Al Gore's movie.
Really?
Yeah, he that switched him.
Yeah.
Really interesting. Another great example of like who the messenger is can really matter, right? Like seeing Al Gore versus the student population say something about climate change might have had more of an impact.
Do you know in which way they were engaging with people at the festival?
That's a great question. I think from the power company's perspective, it was very much about kind of systems that could be visible and collaborating with the festival to do everything from having a stall, programming talks. This is obviously one example. There are also examples of like renewable, like kinetic power charging units. So people could like power their phones, but only if they pedaled hard enough or danced hard enough. Kinetic dance floors that powered the sound system, cycle cinemas. So yeah, maybe solar panels is one of the least engaging methodologies. Thank you for bringing that up. But there are other kinds of renewable energy also that have created more possibility for people to literally engage in them. So yeah, any other examples people have encountered around this kind of thing? Might not even be energy, it might be different kinds of products like sustainable solutions. So cup deposits is another thing that festivals have piloted a lot, which is to get over single-use plastic, to introduce reusable cups that you pay a deposit for. It's branded, you can take it home for £2, you can give it back for your deposit at the end of the day. And some cities are actually looking now at what that would look like across their coffee shops and bars, to create a system where people don't have to throw away coffee cups anymore. Really, in Berlin? With drinks or coffee or?
Beers, it's really common.
Wow.
You just get deposited in. And then there is a startup working on coffee cups. So basically, bars and cafes can like join the network, and you can just get a coffee. And in the morning when you leave your place, you get a reusable cup, and then when you're at work, there would be another cafe that join the network, and you can just leave the cup.
Fantastic.
But there is also a festival in Paris called Wheel of Green, I don't know if you know, and it's built about sustainability and like having musicians, but also having workshops, and everything is ecological. It's a really good festival.
Fantastic. Wheels of Green.
Wheel of Green.
Wheel of Green. Nice.
It's in the middle of the forest, and yeah, you have also like last year there was Bandana Shiva talking.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's really
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
And there's also, I think there's a trend, a really good trend in arts organizations to actually work with their local community, their immediate communities, ask them what their needs are, and then apply in their name. So I know one that found out that the community really wanted a plot of land, an allotment that they've been on a waiting list for at least 10 years. So they said, okay, great. So then they applied a project to say that they're going to grow food with the community and they're going to make this great art project. They got it in a week, and they gave it to the community. And of course they made a project, but I think it's just sometimes about subverting those things as well, and just seeing who has more access to things and how can you facilitate that access.
That's really nice. Yeah, like some cultural spaces have had relationships with their local authority for years. They're funded by them, they know people, so that leverage can be really powerful. That's great ground for collaboration often, where there isn't a consistent representative of a community voice. Absolutely, how can you work through those organisations that have a kind of cultural currency? Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that.
How easy can that, you said about the dance floor and the kinetic energy, how easily can you use that as a source for powering something? Because it sounds like wishful thinking.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? But it's really happening. I don't know the specifics of, like, for example, how like what wattage the system, like the maximum wattage of a sound system, for example, needs to be for a kinetic floor to power it. Again, powerful thinking is a really great resource for some of those really tangible metrics. But it is feasible and it's happening.
It sounds like maybe more of a outreach kind of technology demonstrator, like in line with this idea of connecting people to energy generation. Like, and not being so detached from it, in the same way as, you know, food projects that connect people to actually making food, or, you know, only 1 or 2 degrees away from the actual production of it. Yeah, getting used to the idea that everything you do is energy, and it can be interpreted in electricity or light or sound or anything. It just has loads of manifestations. Yeah, it sounds like it's more like a kind of to connect people with that idea of circularity. And
Yeah, it's both. I mean, I've seen stages like the size of this room, or spaces the size of this room, quite comfortably being powered by floor energy.
So couldn't like street lighting be powered by cars on roads?
There's a company that does that.
Yeah.
And even I think basically that technology does exist. I don't know just the specifics, but it's out there.
Yeah. So finally, this is the Extinction Rebellion closing ceremony. So did anybody kind of spend time with the Extinction Rebellion protests in London or elsewhere this year? Yeah. I found this really interesting because I think it's definitely also worth saying that Extinction Rebellion has been incredible in many ways, and there's also been some kind of teething issues around inclusivity and how accessible it feels for people who don't necessarily want to get arrested, particularly amongst more marginalized communities. But I thought this was the use of arts. Obviously, there's already been a webinar and a workshop and a webinar about their strategies with the arts and culture. So I definitely think that's worth connecting with. But I found this really interesting because it created a space for culture in the sense of our spiritual beliefs and that kind of quieter side of ourselves. I think in the UK we find religion and spirituality quite difficult to talk about, and when we do, it's often quite a divisive topic. But I think there is an aspect to this whole climate crisis which touches that part of us quite deeply. And what was really powerful about this is that it was very inclusive of different traditions from Christianity, Buddhism, Sufism, Judaism, and created a platform from speakers from those different traditions to come together in a kind of celebration of what Extinction Rebellion had achieved, but also to create a space for that expression. It was a kind of ceremonial space in that respect, but I thought it was quite interesting when paired with the activism and kind of on the streets, very frontline work of Extinction Rebellion, because it connected the two in a way that I've very rarely seen in movements, which was really interesting. And I suppose I bring that up because I think culture and arts can be a really powerful space where we can curate and create experiences where it's possible to create space for spirituality, to create space for communities who relate in that way to the world. So, you know, 85% of the world still in some way live their lives through the lens of a religious belief or a spiritual belief. And I think we really put ourselves at risk when we exclude that from the narratives or the approaches that we bring to activism, particularly as the environmental movement in this country, it's getting a lot better. We are still quite homogeneously white and middle class. And so I really think cultural projects and the arts can be a really powerful space where we can create more inclusivity, more space for other people's worldviews and how they connect to what the solutions might be to community transition. And I know that you might have talked about this a bit in the morning as well, but it's really important to connect the dots between what's happening. This is moving us in a slightly different direction, but this is a case study from a piece of work that I did in South Africa 2 years ago, which was working with the National Arts Council of South Africa because they really wanted to initiate a culturally led movement on climate change and climate crisis in the same or in a similar way that we have in the UK. So there's a really live cultural scene, deeply engaged with environmentalism in the UK. And they were saying, okay, how do we mobilize? What can we learn? And what's specific to where we are? And my initial response was, well, we need to find out what's happening because I couldn't believe that it just wasn't. And I had an amazing, very privileged to have an amazing 1 month, kind of very serendipitous and chaotic journey, seeking out people who were doing amazing stuff. So artists, designers, working with communities, and created this map of, probably hundreds, I spoke to tens of, individual artists, organizations, universities who were already working in this way, but were largely unaware that 5 miles down the road there was another project happening. And so culture is great at creating networks and creating a sense of meaning and community, but it needs facilitation sometimes. So really this is to reiterate, when you're doing cultural work, when you're working with artists, or whether you're just doing projects that are not necessarily arts-led, definitely seek out, spend some time connecting and mapping what's happening in your local area, because you will find energy and resources in the form of people who can really make stuff happen and who will have lived experience that's really, really very useful. So in a month we were able to create a connected community of people who suddenly were aware of each other, and although it's very informal and hasn't been able to kind of pick up the kind of energy that we intended, because it needs some resource, there is more of a sense that it's possible to find each other and collaborate.
Could you say a bit more about how you went about connecting those people then?
Yeah, in the first instance, it was through seeking them out and talking to them. And then in those conversations, quite informally saying, I'm also talking to X, Y, and Z. Have you heard of them? Yes or no? Who's in your network? And then sharing a report. I mean, it sounds quite dry, but that came out of it, which basically detailed the case studies, the stories, the locations, the nature of the work that was being done, and giving that to all of them to say, look, this is the community that you're already part of. With resource, we will have, and we hope to do much, much more. But in the first instance, don't underestimate the power of just making people aware of one another and spending time yourself getting to know people, even if they're doing stuff that feels quite different to what you want to be doing. So this mapping also included universities that were starting up design labs that were entirely designed around the community's needs. So I spent time with the University of Soweto, the University of Johannesburg Soweto campus, and they were kind of going out to the community saying, what are your biggest challenges? Food security, huge one for most of the South African population, especially with climate resilience on the agenda. And so they went out and started a project connecting up small-scale farmers who were unaware of each other to start sharing knowledge, and then mobilizing a team of app developers and artists and designers and engineers around those very specific community needs. And suddenly the art, the design, the thinking was in service of something really tangible, and it massively kind of quite rapidly created a community who were suddenly very empowered in numbers to feel like they could make a change in the food system. To suddenly feel like as individual farmers they were able to group their yields to start selling to much bigger buyers and generate more income for their communities to then reinvest in farming, education, food distribution. Yeah. So let's just take a moment to sort of harvest, because I'm sure all of you have case studies and interesting examples of arts-led projects. What is it that particularly we can learn from artists in this space? Or what has stood out for you from some of those case studies?
I'm struggling. I've been a musician my whole life as well, since I was like 13. I'm struggling to see the connection between climate change and art. I'm understanding the ability to maybe build community or the ability to engage with community, but any impact on climate change, I'm really struggling to see how. I mean, I'm ignorant to it. That's what I'm saying. Is I'm struggling. I need more to know how that actually. Obviously, it's not going to reduce carbon emissions, or it's not going to actually have a real world impact. But I'm struggling to see the connection.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Sorry.
No, it's great. Anybody else resonate with that?
I could resonate with a response to it, maybe.
Okay.
I think maybe because you have had a life in music or in art, it's very easy to forget that most people, even if they had some experience with art or creativity at a young age, have one way or another they've had to drop it. They've had to make compromises with their family or with their situation, which meant that they've had to take a job, they've had to go down a certain route that meant that they could provide materially for them and their nearest. And I think there's something about that creative way of living which extends beyond the practice, beyond an artistic practice. And it's actually a lot to do with the precariousness of being an artist. There is a certain amount of autonomy, creative response to issues, the quite wide range of emotions that you get, the amount of resilience you have to build to be able to deal with that, from big highs, big lows. There's a lot I think that other people perhaps have to they could learn from an artistic way rather than maybe just an artistic practice. It's not saying everyone needs to go out and have piano lessons, although I would love that. Give me loads of work. I think there is actually an artistic way, or art maybe extrapolated from a certain practice is more of a way than it is, and stands in opposition to maybe the kind of more formulaic, I need to respond to my immediate circumstances kind of, the way that we're pushed into in a kind of neoclassical economics framework.
Give me more about what the nature of that way is.
Well, I think it's
practically
like I was saying, the way that you respond to issues that present themselves is very different. I think I notice it when I have dealings with people who've had nothing to do with art, especially older people who've grown up and they've had no exposure to art or artistic practice since they were a child, and they've forgotten what that was like. And they're not, when they're confronted with issues, even very simple things, they don't have the lateral thinking to be able to imagine a solution out of it. And I think we forget, if you have that in your life at all, we forget how small a segment of society that is. It's actually very small. Most people have nothing to do with art for most of their lives, except as consumers. And unfortunately, there's so much consumption that it gets bundled in with all the other types of consumption. That's why music musicians and pop stars and stuff, it's as much about the lifestyle that you see these people having as it is about what they're making. In fact, I'd say it's probably much more about the lifestyle and the image they're projecting, and less about the creating. And we totally forget what it's like to live a creative practice in the same way that children do. They try things, they experiment, they get told off by their superiors. It's basically what artists do most of the time. And I think that there are lessons that can be told from that story, which most people have they've completely forgotten what that time in their life was like, and they could really benefit from that way.
Yeah. So I think that's definitely one of the things, it's the, being able to awaken people's sense of possibility, that a different version of the future's possible. It's the facilitation of getting people to kind of connect with their agency. Yeah, I can grow food, or yeah, I could sing. I could feel part of something. And I think that imagination piece is really important. I think we kind of suffer from a real failure of imagination in when we kind of confine ourselves to the norm, like the way things are. And because there's a lot of fear involved in creativity. It engages with the unknown. It combines ideas that haven't been combined before. There is a sense of experimentation and play and possibility that's often educated out of us in this part of the world, I should say. There are some cultures and traditions that don't even have a word for creativity because they kind of find the idea ludicrous because it's so accepted as an innate part of who they are. But I certainly think that's part of it. And the other, which connects very practically, is this idea that like when we hold spaces that are designed to be more playful and surprising in a kind of safe way, that when you show up to a piece of theatre or a festival or a community project, you're going to expect something a bit different, and you're almost primed to suspend your disbelief or enter into exactly, the spirit of something. And I guess finally, I think let's not underestimate the power of just simply creating an opportunity for people to belong and to be part of something, or to create meaning together, even if that meaning feels a little bit superficial in comparison to the grand challenge of the climate crisis. That we also, I don't know, how do people feel about this? Sometimes I feel very privileged to be involved in the communities I am and in the cultural activities I am, because it brings a lot of meaning to my life. And I can often forget that those, commonplace rituals of everyday life for me aren't necessarily things that other people have. But yeah, how does that spark for you?
I still sort of feel the same.
I love it. Yeah.
I'm just being really honest though, because I understand that it brings people together. I understand that it can bring more of a sense of community. And then I suppose I'm making the link that if that community then gets engaged in something that is practical around climate resilience, so that theatre one is a good example, obviously, because that is something practical. I suppose I've sort of seen it a bit too much like, just how does art suddenly make some change to climate? It's like, I just haven't made that link, but I suppose if you use it to engage people, make them feel maybe just a bit looser, you know what I mean, and then they're like a bit more open, and then they do want to, and then you funnel that towards something practical, then I can see how like it actually has impact, like practical, pragmatic, measurable impact on climate, on the problem at hand. Because otherwise it's just everyone feeling good.
Can I just say
Sorry.
Just
Thank you. Yeah.
I mean, I think though everyone feeling good wouldn't be the end of the world. If
No.
anything, maybe that's kind of what we need. I think there's like a under that sort of deep adaptation idea, you know, it's like, how do we soothe ourselves in this challenging time and not kind of perhaps lose, you know, culture, humour,
Irony.
yeah, whatever, you know, like a creative practice. Because if we're just focused on, you know, like, let's say the more tangible solutions, which I think we do need to sort of sustain ourselves and have food and energy, but if we lose the culture part, then it's almost like, what are we fighting for? I think you need both.
And there's also this idea that most artists come from a place of dispossession. You know, it's whether you feel different from most people, it's whether, you know, your economic or cultural background is different, whatever. Like, there's always something there, right, that makes you think you are a bit different from other people. And I think because most artists, particularly in the UK, live very precarious lives, it makes it so much easier for people to connect with them on an individual level. And I think most people are much more prone to kind of get involved with artists rather than listening to politicians, because politicians are people who are not us and will never be like them, and hopefully we never want to be like them. You know, and obviously depending on the politicians. But I just think there is something about a movement being driven by people who come from the same place as most people, you know, and some of those people are artists and some of those people can be psychologists, you know, who can actually say, these are human behavioral patterns, this is how we can change them in a way or another, you know. But I think there is this sense of community, which is exactly what you're saying. If I trust you, and then, so you empower me, then I do so much more, you know. I think power does come from, like, other people, you know, than the people we expect it to come from.
That's lovely.
When you listen to people that are not talking to promote something or to better themselves, then you instantly trust them. So listening to some of the talks today, doing it for something that's going to benefit everyone, and so listening to people from where you come from or your community that are talking to you, not to hire themselves up a ladder, it definitely helps, and I can relate more to that.
Thank you. And I do think you've raised a really important point, which is, you know, we could talk generally about artists and cultural projects, but in this instance we are talking about the role of arts and culture in service of an outcome, which is, you know, change. So I think you've hit on something important, which is, what is this in service of? And is it kind of creating the possibility for doing things differently? Is it supporting solutions? And I absolutely think that it's good not to lose sight of that. You know, in some conversations, certainly not in the last couple of years, but when I first started out in this, with creatives and artists kind of just bringing them on board, there was a sense of, okay, but I don't want to make work which is instrumental. I don't want to be told what my message should be. And my way of reframing that was, look, we all work with budgetary constraints, we work with constraints of space, our own biases, as you were saying earlier, Dana. This is another constraint. We have to operate within the limits of the environment and its capacity to support us, and, you know, even better if we can be kind of mobilizing our cultural skills, and by that I mean culture in terms of what underpins society, to take people on a journey that brings them along closer to that possible future.
Yeah. And I just thought as well, maybe I did a little bit waiting to speak while I was listening to you, but just one song can change a generation as well, though. That's another thing I just thought, like, art has the ability to hit the heart, and maybe the heart is where people really act from, and yeah, so that probably factors into this as well.
Absolutely. I mean, we can focus too much on the technical solutions to climate change, and it hasn't worked. We can. We have all of the technical solutions, so why hasn't it happened? And I think that point of yours, I think there's many reasons, you're right, but that point of yours about activating the part of ourselves, which is profound and feels and connects.
Cares.
And absolutely.
Yeah, art can hit your emotions, and then that makes you care and Love. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Oh,
Sold.
so glad.
Really sorry, I need to go, but this was
Okay, well, thank you for being here, Dana.
We're running another one on Thursday that's kind of similar in the afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we're into the last stretch, the last half an hour. So I'm going to power through how some of this translates into the kind of nuts and bolts of leading campaigns, projects, etc., in service of change. So we've talked about the emotional process and being conscious of that, and this will map onto that change curve, some of the different processes we can use to take people on a journey with us. And one of the most important is defining purpose. It's come up actually, I think, quite a lot in the conversations we've already been having. And that point about unclarity versus uncertainty and getting really clear. So what's your purpose? It's okay for a purpose to change, but it's really important for it to be clear at every stage. So what's the change you want to make? What do you want the outcome to be? How will you know you've succeeded? All of that's really important. Now, in some scenarios, you will decide that because you have a certain degree of knowledge and research and mapping that will tell you what we really need to do in this community is to install solar panels within the next 6 months. And it will be really clear, and your goal will be to get people on board with that as quickly as possible. That's your community engagement challenge. It might be that you're in a completely different context and you want to, for a number of reasons, collaboratively decide with the community what that purpose is because you want people to feel a high degree of ownership and motivation to make it happen. And that's really important, not so much, well, it can be for technical solutions actually, but that's really important for behavioral solutions. So things like, longer, more durational projects like transition towns, which are really trying to create a complete transformation in a place and require people's expertise, people's energy and engagement over a longer period of time. Or it could be, we want to create a project and this is a new community for us, so let's create a high degree of ownership and come up collectively with an idea that's really going to land. Whichever approach you take, purpose is really important. And often that purpose will be tied to what is it you're trying to improve. This is one model of different climate issues, but this is 10 principles put together by the bioregional movement, and it describes 10 different ways of meeting climate change through from health and happiness from a climate change perspective. So that might be air pollution and well-being, the capacity for people to kind of care for themselves, equity and local economy, which is sustainable, or it could be zero waste, sustainable transport, whatever it is. It's good to be really clear about what you're trying to improve and what the benefits are to people. People will want to know what's in it for me. That's really important. Finding that out by listening. What do people care about? And then communicating messages that say, you care about this, and solving this problem together, solving sustainable transport together will mean your kids are not having respiratory problems from air pollution. That's what's in it for you. And then what can be quite important, like whether it's a cultural project or a kind of practical community project, is what do you actually control? What is in your power to make happen? And what is it that you might have influence over? So I find this kind of target quite useful when you're kind of brainstorming or putting a lot of ideas together. Center, what can you actually control? What could you do tomorrow? Influence, what could you influence other people to be part of and maybe change together? Anything outside of that, you kind of keep, but it's your long-term priority. It might be possible in the future, but it's not the most effective place to put your time and energy now. So choosing the right approach. The key principles to any kind of change project are for you to really embody the values you're trying to bring people on board with yourself. So what you do really matters to build trust, to build credibility, and those two things really I think it comes down to. Integrity. Providing a clear vision or co-creating a clear vision particularly when you're in collaboration with people, having a shared vision of where you want to head together is really important. And the what if question is really powerful. I know things feel really impossible, but what if we had sustainable transport? What would that feel like? What would it look like? And using that to kind of paint a picture together. Facilitating a process and maintaining focus. Your job as a kind of campaign or project leader is to keep bringing people back to that primary purpose. I know it might feel really interesting to explore a kinetically powered playground, but let's reevaluate if that's really taking us in the direction we need to be as quickly as we need to get there. Enabling and empowering people by questions, by using creativity, by offering them space to take initiative and have ideas, and creating transparency and accountability. How are you going to measure progress? You know, do you want to change? Do you want to reduce carbon emissions? Great. How are you going to measure that? How are you going to make that measurement transparent to people? People are really motivated by knowing and celebrating a difference that they've made together. Part of the problem with climate change is that individuals feel like their individual impact makes no difference, even if they've gone vegan and stopped flying and whatever else. But when you get a community together who are sharing that data, whatever it is, social or actual kind of numbers data, and they can see their collective impact, that's really powerful. And when you spend time actually celebrating that with cake or, you know, locally sourced wine or whatever it is that you choose, music, whatever, it really helps. I think we've covered quite a lot of that. So the question, do you need to design a new solution or engage people to implement an existing one, is pretty key. For the first, do you need to design a new solution? A design-led process is really useful. So we talked about that empathy mapping before. That's the first stage. Understand the people who you're trying to engage and the environment and its problems that you're trying to change. Specifically, what's going on, what needs to happen. And then the design-led process basically takes you from that empathy into brainstorming, interpreting that knowledge into possible ideas, prototyping those ideas and getting feedback. Did this work? No. Why? Shall we junk it? No, let's adapt it, or whatever. And if it worked, how could we make it better? And then translating that prototyping into an actual solution. An example of that, has anybody heard of the Granby Streets project that Assemble, the architect collective, did a few years ago? So they went up to a part of Liverpool called Granby Street, and it's a pretty tough place. It's pretty derelict. The houses are falling down. There's a lot of disused properties. But they went up there with a curiosity and an intention to regenerate this place as sustainably as possible. And they realized that there were already some community members going around planting stuff and painting walls. And with them, they could say, okay, what are the real challenges? What's your experience? What do you need? And then began to design a really ambitious and beautiful project which reconstructed some of the houses to demonstrate what's possible. They started a community workshop where they started making lamps and tiles and all kinds of products out of waste from that area. And they set up a community cafe. All of that is now generating a hyper-local income for that economy, that local economy, feeding into adapting more houses and financing more change. Again, they were able to leverage funding into that because of their position as a kind of desirable young architecture collective. So really, the principles for that are about getting curious, building empathy, allowing failure. A little bit of failure is okay because failure is really learning, but staying accountable to it. When things don't work, learn, make sure that it doesn't happen again and move forward. Don't discount what might sound like bad ideas, because that's your judgment coming in. Spend a bit of time with it before deciding it's terrible. Share power. Empower people who have good ideas as much as possible, because it doesn't make sense doing everything ourselves. And again, set some evaluation criteria. What does success look like? And that might evolve as you go forward, but have something to be accountable to. And get over perfection. We're also terrified of things not working out, that often that can prevent us from really taking risks. And the second solution, so we know that there's a good solution out there. We just need to get people on board with doing it. So this is the example of the Arcola Theatre, which is quite local to here. Has anybody been to Arcola? yet? So years ago, they appointed an engineer as their executive director because he kind of self-selected himself for the role. And his interest was, how can we, in a creative space, initiate a kind of innovation project around energy and use the ingenuity of artists and this space and a community around us to develop that technology. In their case, it's hydrogen fuel cell power, and get it to the point where it's viable and scalable to make a difference in that community and all over the world, and they've done it. But they also wanted to make the building as sustainable as possible as well, and they knew that the answer to that was using less power, conserving water, all of the nuts and bolts stuff we know just needs to happen. And they used a process of change which is much more kind of step by step. And that basically involves increasing urgency, informing people why that there is an urgent need for change and what's in it for them, building teams of interest. So these are the things we need to do. Who's interested? Who wants to be involved? Who's got expertise? In another art space that I know of, they realized that someone working in the box office had a master's degree in environmental management, and they had no idea before, and suddenly this person became a critical stakeholder in helping them with their process. So who's got what expertise? Getting the vision right. What's a vision we're all excited about at the end of getting these things done to keep us motivated? Communicate consistently what we're doing, who's doing what, celebrating people, what's not working, and continually reinventing that. Enabling action where people have good ideas, creating short-term wins, we reduced energy by 10% because people are just turning off the lights, and celebrate that to motivate people. And don't let up. This is the hardest thing with any community engagement. Keep going until these things are embedded. And that's a whole other, that's a topic for a whole other webinar, I think, around how we sustain ourselves when we're going about this work. So the top tips from this approach of we know what needs to happen, let's get to it, are about reframing change as a creative challenge. So in their case, they wanted to do something which at the time had never really been done in a kind of semi-commercial fringe theatre, which was to light a show with 5 kilowatts, which is nothing when it comes to a theatre show. And LED lighting, which is the only solution at that level of energy, was typically at the time thought of as inappropriate for lighting skin and a beautiful kind of atmosphere. But they went to the artistic team and said, what if? Is it possible? Could we do this? Not do this, you need to use 5 kilowatts. And suddenly, with that kind of sense of possibility, they did it, it was beautiful, and it really changed the perception of what that technology could be used for. So how can we reframe change as a creative challenge? Making it manageable. People want small-scale change first and build up to big-scale change. Think about the change curve and that experience of basically grief and fear that people go through in response to change. Break it down, make it possible, and make it speak to people's desires and needs. Adjust your message to specific people. That's where the empathy mapping comes in. Make it fit your personality and the personality, maybe the organisation you're working through. Wembley Stadium started introducing energy referees who went round with yellow and red cards and blowing whistles when people weren't doing the things they were supposed to, like turning their computers off. So again, cultivate your sense of fun and possibility. And then connect the small wins to the big picture and think about timing. If things are changing anyway, it's the best time to change everything because people are already going through that pace of change. So I know I'm really racing through this stuff and we're running out of time. So what I will do is just say that there are kind of different methodologies for communicating to people. And I'll just race through them. But depending on the situation, like we were saying, sometimes you just need to inform people of some information that will help them be more sustainable. So this example is Latitude Festival saying, did you know we have waste kits for campers that helps you manage your waste? We have a cup deposit scheme. We have sustainable transport you can use. Just informing people of their options. Then there's persuasion, like storytelling to convince people to change the way they are. and the decisions they make. So the documentary Blackfish came out about how killer whales are being treated in SeaWorld sites, and basically led to SeaWorld's profits dropping by 50% because kids were suddenly refusing to go and preventing their parents from planning SeaWorld visits. It also enjoyed some kind of celebrity endorsement and awareness raising, which for some circumstances can help. Then there's like participation. So has anybody heard of Fashion Revolution? Yeah? So it popped up after the Rana Plaza disasters, so factories in Bangladesh collapsing on factory fabric workers because the safety standards were so bad. So Fashion Revolution popped up as an ethical fashion campaign, which got people to ask, you know, who made my clothes, raise awareness, and raise demand for more ethical practices in the fashion industry. And so it had a message, but it gave a really tangible way for people to feel like they could be part of the campaign. Check your label, take a picture, ask your favorite brands what they're doing and how they could be more ethical. So again, how can you create manageable ways for people to initially participate in something and generate that energy for doing something differently? And then there is, at the more deeper level, like delegating and creating a movement of people who together can initiate change by creating a lot of autonomy amongst others to act on their own back, but towards a shared vision. And again, we don't have so much time to talk through this, but what that looks like is creating that really solid pillar of a shared vision, shared values, a shared understanding of what needs to change, and then creating mechanisms for people to feel empowered. So networks for knowledge sharing, action learning, which is basically a group coaching technique to collectively problem solve and mine the expertise of different people, and then empowering people also through evaluation and learning. So those are 4 different approaches. And really, like, a lot of it comes down to going to where the support is. So don't worry too much, and I know this feels so counterintuitive with the kind of urgency we're working with, but if people are really adamantly not wanting to engage, don't waste your energy there. Go to where the energy is and build from there, because if you have a really strong core, so Extinction Rebellion's goal is 3.5% of the population to create a tipping point. So that feels like a really small percentage, but actually if you take that, it's a really good principle for engaging communities. Engage a small core of passionate people and empower them to create a ripple effect. Yeah. And we've talked a bit about this, but how we kind of create ecologies of change, how we reach out to other people who are passionately working towards the same shared vision so that we can feel ourselves part of something bigger, even when we're trying to create projects and movements.
Sort of thoughts on how you do reach out to other organisations or people and try and build those bridges?
Yeah. Does anybody in the room have any responses first? How do we build bridges?
Particularly with organisations, maybe we maybe have a...
Don't email first, always phone up at least. Don't just cold email people. I think it's get on the phone.
Person to person.
If you get on the phone, you generally always do better, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just personal.
Or find out where people live and stand outside their house and that works really well.
Also an option. You might get arrested, but it's, yeah, I mean...
That's how we run election campaigns in Russia.
Yeah? Just intimidation. It's a possibility. Well, I mean, I'll just kind of refer to this again super quickly. Consensus building is not so different from engaging people. Finding out what they care about and what their priorities are is a really important part of it. So I'm involved in another project at the moment which is trying to create a nationwide festival of climate action. And going to kind of different partners, everybody says, yes, this is so important, we want to engage. But we've set our priorities for the next 2 years, and they are diversity and inclusion, which is what everybody is talking about quite rightly, but we need to be talking about in the context of climate change. And my point was, that's great, because climate breakdown is an inclusion issue. How can we find a way to bring something which is meaningful to all of the groups you're trying to connect with and bring them together under this shared vision? So not necessarily the best example plucked from the top of my head, but what is the connecting point between what they care about and what you care about and what you need to do? There is often a third way, and a good process is map the issues, and you can do a lot of that with research. So if you want to engage a particular organisation, chances are they've talked about their values on their website, they've talked about what they do, they might even have reports about previous activity that you can look into. You can get a real sense of, okay, what are their core issues? What are they funded to do? What are they accountable to? And then say, okay, what is the intersecting point between my agenda and their issues? And start from that place. That's the common ground. That's the starting point for building common ground. And then focus on a higher purpose. Often we go straight to how are we going to do this thing? You care about this, I care about this. How are we going to make change happen? Often it's good to take a step back and say, hang on, why is it in both of our interests to make this happen? That kind of why question is incredibly important, because that creates a sense of shared vision and goals and purpose, and make space for both to contribute. And it's good to check in. Do you really want to work with this organisation? Are they the best people to do this with? Are they open to cooperation and thinking differently? If they're not, it could be a whole lot of energy. Whereas they might be, if they're not that open to kind of cooperation, they might be an organisation 5 years down the line when you've already made a lot of headway, who are suddenly like, we're not involved. We should be involved. How can we be involved? And that might be the best point for a connection with them. And are people ready to focus on how things can be better? Some people are still stuck in, I kind of want to be in the shock, denial and depression space. Yeah. And the best thing you can do for them is to keep informing them, and so that they know that there's a door open. But it's not necessarily the place to put energy.
Shit, but it's my shit.
Huh?
It might be shit, but it's my shit. That's how I think a lot of people
right.
attach to how glum and depressive their situation is because it's what they know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's safe.
Yeah.
It's safe.
Yeah.
And again, creativity can be something that is quite powerful in switching that up. So that's the story. Overall, there's so much more to say, but we are nearing the end of our time together. So I thought it would be good just to kind of take a moment. I mean, this is just a, crass slide saying that, sharing our successes and failure and celebrating throughout is so very important. Sam said earlier that fun and feeling good shouldn't have to be kind of like a sideline to this whole process. Actually, the mental health crisis around climate breakdown is so big that actually feeling good about even small change is a really important part of staying motivated. And, change can feel almost snail's pace, can feel like nothing's happening fast enough, but often when we look back, which is also an important part of this, we see that quite a lot has shifted. So keep that sense of perspective. So, yeah. I think just take a moment in your pairs, like a minute, just to breathe and connect on what am I taking away before we do a kind of final circle together with our friends online and whoever might be listening later. And then we can kind of relax and have a beer and kind of stick around if people want to do that. So just get into a pair, and if we're missing a pair, I can pair up with someone. Or maybe Sam and I can sit out. Just a minute each. What's one thing I'm taking away?
Active listening, right?
Actively listening to each other. And just feel your way, about a minute each. Go for it.